I'm Janet Thomas, one of the co-project directors for Mountain States. And right now it is my pleasure to introduce our next session entitled Ethical Genomic Research with Indigenous Communities. This will be presented by Ms. Rene Begay. Ms. Begay is a research assistant at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus School of Public Health. Please see her full bio on the attendee website. Also, please reference on your screen for CEU accreditation and disclosure statements, as well as in the CEU tab in the attendance website. Ms. Begay, you may now begin your presentation, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Thank you for that introduction. So to introduce my title, Ethical Genomics Research with Indigenous Communities, and I'm also a MPH student with Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, as well as a PRA at Anschutz Medical Campus. And I'd just like to thank the organizers for having me here today. So my outline of my talk is going to be around my background and more introduction, and then examples of genetics research with human subjects or participants, and then ethical genomics research framework that me and several other Indigenous geneticists put together, and that was published in Nature. And then I see this movement of genomic or Indigenous genomic researchers doing research for their communities, for Native people, and what the result of that has been. So Yate she Rene Begay ni she Toto ni she Ashe Bajichin Tatini Deshiche Kiani Deshnala. So I'm from Navajo Nation, just outside of Chinle, Arizona. And I just mentioned to you my education and my background. And this is just photos of where I'm from, United States map, and then also a picture of my home. And I'd just like to give a brief introduction to Indigenous peoples in the US. So currently there are 574 federally recognized tribal nations around across 35 states and 334 reservations, about 229 villages in Alaska. And we're all sovereign nations. So we have this government to government relationship with states and the US government. And just a little bit of history, we've gone through several periods of assimilation and forced removal and providing of allotment of land, and then taking of land, and then leasing land. And also right now we're currently in the nation to nation period. So this is where a lot of Native communities are self-governed. We can determine what we're doing with our resources, our economy, our health, and so on. And these are actually more applicable to federally recognized tribes. There's a lot of state recognized tribes, and there's also tribes that do not have any recognition. But the final point I want to make about all of these Native communities is that we have unique culture, language, traditions, government, social norms, and research priorities. Speaking of research, I am showing this figure here on the slide, and the picture that I'm showing here is from an article that was published back in the early 2000s. And the paper went to compare how many individuals who are from diverse backgrounds are included in GWAS studies. So GWAS studies help identify inherited genetic variants that are associated with risk of disease variants by comparing cases and controls. So in 2009, there were 373 studies, and only 4% were from non-European ancestry, and the rest are from European ancestry. And then in 2016, there were 2,511 studies that were GWAS, and 19% were from non-European ancestry. However, the number of Native participants did not increase. If anything, it decreased. And this stark underrepresentation leads to inequities and leaves Indigenous peoples out of the equation, or out of the benefits of genetics research. And it leads to incomprehensive genetic testing panels, incomplete reference panels, and then precision medicine not as precise for diverse communities. So these are just factors or additional factors that I think are leading to the contribution of exclusion of Native people in large genetic studies or just genetic studies in general. And this is due to financial constraints, time constraints, and geographic location. So financial constraints due to grants. So grants being only 3 years, 5 years long, and those time constraints where you really need to engage. And if you're following best practices and engaging with Indigenous communities, you really want to have community engagement and relationships and making sure that you're really involving the community and from the beginning of the project to the end in the dissemination process. And then of course, a lot of tribal nations are pretty rural. Not a lot of them are within large urban communities and then also or cities. And also these tribal nations are most likely not near any of these large academic healthcare hubs where a lot of this genetic sequencing and research is going on. And also, why would Indigenous peoples engage in genetics research if there's already this lack of access to quality healthcare? So they're already just trying to deal with their current health and getting healthcare and navigating the healthcare system. So this extra burden of participating in health research can be a barrier. And then large databases already having plenty of samples. However, they probably are from European ancestry background, but having already these large databases and maybe having a few from diverse or underrepresented backgrounds. So why would people want to do research on new samples and do all this community engagement and find all this funding when there's already these large databases available to do research? And then of course, distrust in the academic and medical community. And I'll go over some examples of how that came about. And then research findings leading to stigmatization or misuse. So participating in genetics research leading to stigma about where we came from or just having that conflict between culture and science. So this first example is a population that is located in the west coast of Vancouver Island, the Nutchalluth, and they donated 800 samples to study high rates of rheumatoid arthritis. And this group participated in the 1980s, and this researcher actually did some studying of rheumatoid arthritis, but didn't find anything, or at least anything significant, but did not come back to the community and actually handed out or provided samples to other researchers to do whatever health research they were doing, and no results were returned to the people. And the person went years actually traveling around, moving the samples from institution to institution, and it was actually studying other things like HIV and AIDS, drug abuse, and ancestry, and then published over 200 papers. And the samples were eventually returned, but only after the tribe actually created a bunch of noise, right? They went to the media, they wrote in a newsletter, they reached out to the institutions, and they were just really creating a lot of noise through the media to figure out where this researcher was and where the samples were and try to really get all of the samples back. And of course, the more famous case that has happened more recently. So Arizona State University, located in Arizona, a researcher approached the Havasupai tribe in 1989 to conduct diabetes research. And I think the tribe really wanted to engage in this study because genetics research was really up and coming around that time. And they had high rates of diabetes and they really wanted to know what was going on. And they're a pretty remote tribe inside the Grand Canyon. But there was talk of written consent to study the causes of behavioral and medical disorders. So the consent process was kind of vague. It was not as specific as it could have been. So in some instances, the researcher said, she did get written consent, but then other tribal members said they just remember getting verbal consent. But I think the main message was that they thought that they were going to get diabetes research results back, but then actually the researcher didn't even come back and provide any significant results, or even if they weren't significant, the researcher did not come back. So there was a lot of unauthorized use of the DNA samples again. Samples were being shipped to other researchers at other institutions for different types of studies. And some of the studies that they were doing at ASU was studying schizophrenia, inbreeding and population migration. But the tribe eventually sued the university and they settled out the court. And the only reason that the tribe knew about this and that this huge distrust and misuse of samples was because an individual who's from the Havasupai tribe actually attended ASU and was a student and was attending a talk and actually realized that this individual was talking about the Havasupai tribe, her people, and they were studying schizophrenia and all these other things. So in the picture you see on your left, you see the individuals eventually got their samples back and they were allowed to dispose or do what they want with the samples to their discretion, whether that was ceremonial, traditional practices of any kind. But they got their samples back, which is the key thing here. But it led to a lot of mistrust in the research community. So I would like to talk a little bit more about something that was a little bit more personal for me because I'm from the Navajo Nation. I think a lot of you know that there is a ban on genetics or genomics research on tribal lands on the Navajo Nation. And this was put in place in 2002. So it's almost been about 2 decades right now. And they did this because they had concerns about patenting genes, genomes. Obviously, they heard about the Havasupai case. So they really were trying to figure out how does genetics research fit within the realm of the Navajo Nation and the culture at the time and the traditions. And they brought together a lot of tribal leaders, healers, and people from Western scientific training. And the Navajo Nation ultimately recognized there was a lack of policies or guidelines for genetics research protocols. So they put a moratorium in place. So that kind of leads to this paper here, where a group of us who are Navajo from the Navajo Nation, with the exception of one of the authors who is pretty much an honoree, is adopted into the tribe because he's been with the tribe for many, many, many years. But the weaving of the strands of life in a big old history of genetic research involving Navajo people. So I led this paper, this review paper, to look at all the genetic studies that involve Navajo people. And these are the results. We looked at 508 total articles and 329 were excluded because they were not genetic or they did not involve Navajo people or was not original research. And we looked at 79 studies in total for human leukocyte antigen and blood studies, complex diseases, bacterial and virus studies, population genetics and migration, and hereditary diseases. So we had about 4 forensic articles, about 12 HLA and blood combined, 8 complex, 12 bacterial and virus, 19 population genetics and migration, and 24 articles that related to hereditary diseases. So the moratorium was established in 2002, which influenced the frequency and types of genetics research. So this was one of the figures that we put in the article, and a lot of the studies were published. The range of studies that were published were from 1920s all the way to most recent, or when we published the paper, which is 2018. And we categorized these papers into all other studies, bacterial and viral studies, and blood HLA studies. So as you can see, the blood HLA kind of was pretty low, but it kind of stayed steady. But then you see the bacterial viral studies actually increases after the moratorium. And then you see all other studies actually was really high, but then eventually decreased because of the moratorium. So I think in a way, what we're trying to say here is that the moratorium really deterred researchers from all over the place to just collect DNA samples or collect biospecimens and look at genetics. And furthermore, the paper, I think, is really unique in that it really highlights who we are as Native people. There has been a couple of review papers that kind of did a similar thing that we did, but it was from a non-Indigenous person who is not from the community. And they did not talk, and many of the papers that we had did not talk about who we are as people and how we understand genetics. And so that's what we incorporated into the paper. So for many for many decades, a lot of our people knew what genetics was, even though they didn't use that specific term. As you can see on the left, we knew about breeding, and that, you know, if you combine certain animals together and you want certain color of fur or wool or texture or anything like that, we knew that you can get that by bringing together certain animals. And we would use that wool actually to make rugs. So you can see here at the bottom, this is actually one of my aunt's rugs. And so this is a long history of cultural practices in which genetics kind of is like the base of this practice. And then we also have a complex clan system. I introduced myself in the beginning, and I introduced my 4 clans, and those clans stem from my mother, my father, my maternal and paternal grandfathers. And so that helps place me within my family and my relatives, and who I'm related to and who I come from. And this also helped to deter sort of like intermarrying individuals of similar clans. And so this pedigree kind of shows who we know and how we're related. So furthermore, the results from the paper, we saw a lot of tribal or academic approvals were not mentioned. And I think it has to do a little bit with the times. In 1920s, there weren't a lot of push for journals to say you need an ethical statement within your methods. And so I think that improved over time as you got closer to 2018, but it still wasn't, I think, not enough. Conducted by non-Indigenous researchers, with the exception of some of the bacterial and virus and skid studies. There were a lot of small sample sizes within these papers, especially in the early like 1920s, 30s, 40s. A lot of the papers made sweeping claims about Navajo people and genetic disorders when they only had an N of 1. Or just one family, and made huge claims about us and genetics. And then exclusion of DNA cultural perspectives, like I mentioned. So there's this idea of Hajan, so holistic health, in which we think about our emotional, mental, and spiritual and physical well-being. And it's important to our Genetic way of living. So if an individual has a genetic disorder, I mean, who's to say it's not contributed to something else being out of character or out of place in our life, or the social struggles that were going on because we were also displaced from our homelands and forced to walk hundreds of miles more south to a military base. And that kind of gets into this whole, this long walk that happened. And so how can you say we have genetic disorders when you haven't really understood the cultural and social influences of these kinds of movements that have happened within our community? And then also we just really advocate for future inclusion of Indigenous genetic researchers and just health researchers and students who are getting their higher degrees, who live on these tribal nations in the community or within the institutions. Really, we have a lot of youth who are coming up and are getting educated in these in genetics research, but also in all sciences and engineering and so on. So I'd just like to move into this 6 guiding ethical principles that was published in Nature, and it's a framework for enhancing ethical genomic research with Indigenous communities. And several of the co-authors are also Native. And this is the framework that this figure on the left pretty much sums up what we wanted to articulate, and that is these are the pillars and ideals and principles that we hope that genetics researchers or genomics researchers, or really anyone who wants to engage with Indigenous communities in health research, to abide by these principles and really think about these components and incorporate it into their research protocols. And the goals of the framework is to build trust, demand for ethical genetics research, and increase diversity within the genetics research practice, and then increase benefits to the individuals who are ultimately loaning out their DNA or loaning their biospecimens to these researchers. So the first one is understanding tribal research rules and regulations, looking to tribal IRBs, even if they're not nationally recognized, there's probably one that's local, one that's regional, one that's maybe Indian Health Service, and then also research review boards. Maybe there's just a small group that's like an elders council or community council that come together to talk about research that's going on within their communities. And then collaborate with the community as partners, not subjects. So from the beginning to the end of the research process, they should be partners in development, conception, writing, doing the actual in-lab stuff and coming up with the hypotheses and so on. And then build cultural competency. So listen and learn from the community, try to understand their culture and language and their history and traditional ways of knowing. So be at social gatherings, maybe read a few books about the community and also ask for people to share their stories if they're willing, and then integrate science with community values. And then of course, providing transparency, really talking to the community and letting them know what's going on. What is, the IRB process look like for your institution, letting them know that, okay, our paper was rejected from this journal. So what's the next step? Just really like getting at the nuance of, okay, you guys are partners and we're just trying to let you in on what are the steps. So making known the goals and hypotheses, and do not overpromise outcomes from the research. I think it's fair to be real that maybe you start this project and you say we're committed, and maybe we'll have an answer 30 years down the road, but we're committed and we're willing to stick around and really continue to work on this relationship. And then build tribal capacity, so involve and train local community members or students in the research to help with the research study. And then dissemination, so work with the communities on how to present the research. Maybe you go to a social gathering, or you go to a tribal council meeting, or you go to an online meeting that's happening with an advisory board of some sort, or Indian Health Service, or you pass out flyers, whatever that may be. Just really work with the community to disseminate findings. And so these principles help to provide a platform to provide an ethical way to engage with Indigenous communities and genetics research. And this will take time and deliberate efforts to follow from both the community and the researchers, provide a pathway to including underrepresented populations. And then, of course, scientific advancements are distributed more equitably if we do it this way and use this framework, and address and prevent further mistrust in the scientific community. And then I just want to do a plug for the summer internship for Indigenous peoples and genomics, and it's catered for Native students who want to get more training in these topics of ethics and get some lab training and meet other Native students who are interested in science. And I've been a part of SING actually since 2014, and I also help teach as well. And we've taught over 200 students. We have a website, singconsortium.org. It's a 1-week summer workshop. Last year it was virtual, but due to the pandemic, and it's provided a lot of collaboration where we published like the framework, the lit review paper, and so on, and there's more forthcoming. And then now it's international. So now we have a SING Canada, we have a SING Aotearoa in New Zealand, SING Australia, SING Mexico is up and coming. So there's all these different week-long workshops that are happening within these countries, and it's just a way for Indigenous communities within these countries to really regain the platform where they can kind of, do the research for their communities. And so it's like buying for Indigenous people. And so this is one of the international conferences that I went to last year in January, just before things kind of closed down in New Zealand. And we discussed ethical concerns within the community and presented community-based genomic research. So we're all researchers in some capacity or healthcare professionals working just to improve research within our communities. And it was really great to be there. And lastly, I just want to end by talking a little bit about this movement that I was mentioning in the beginning, and that it's important to learn about the current initiatives that are being done by Indigenous people. So we have this Genomics Aotearoa New Zealand, the Bariome is what they're called, and they're really trying to create frameworks that are Indigenous led and do genetics research that are applicable to them. And then the Silent Genomes Project, which is in Canada, and they're actually creating a biobank and really working with their people to gather specimens. And it sounds like they're really for that, and they're just really leading the charge there for their communities. And then the Native Biodata Consortium, which is in the Midwest in the US, and it's Native led as well, and it's a biobank that they're doing a lot of the research for their community, and it's being run by the Native community there. And then SAMRI, which also is looking at diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and that is also Native led as well. So just learn more about these initiatives that are coming up and that are leading the way and taking the charge, and maybe collaborating with them, and to learn the history of Indigenous communities in your area is another way to help, support Native initiatives and to work with Native people, and then find ways to incorporate the ethical framework into your practice. And I think that's it. So I would like to entertain any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Begay, for a wonderful presentation. Very interesting, and I think kind of thought-provoking, especially given the history that we have with working with Indigenous populations. So we already do have a couple questions. So the first question, it says, of course, this is likely to vary from tribe to tribe, but are there any general modifications a genetic counselor could make in their language or process when taking a family history for patients of Indigenous descent?
Yeah, so I think I got asked this question not too long ago, and it was by genetic counselors as well. And I think it's just a matter of listening, asking the individual what their connection to DNA and genetics is, and really figuring out how to navigate that, because I know that a lot of this is, respecting traditional viewpoints, respecting traditional culture and things like that. But a lot of Natives are not brought up in the traditional culture. So a lot of them probably don't recognize that. And so I think just learning about their background and what they know and how they feel about DNA and genetics. And I think just being honest, what this genetics testing can do for them and their family history, and just really being transparent that if they need to make decisions about, testing or preventative therapies or anything like that, that they should talk with their family and have that honest discussion. And I think genetic counselors are probably already trained to do that. So I feel like genetic counselors are kind of leading the way in that they already kind of really try to work with the individual and their families and be respectful. And I think with Native people, you just do the same thing and just be honest, and also maybe even kind of bring up the fact that you recognize that they have, self-determination, that they, have a huge history that's that has a history of mistrust and distrust in the medical and research community, and just being honest about that, I think, is important.
Very good. I did forget to mention that if you do have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A tab within the attendee website, and then we will be able to see those. So second question that came through was, can you tell us where we can find more information about SING?
Yeah, so SING has its own website, and you actually can see all of these different SINGs that are coming up on singconsortium.org. It's a website, and we also have a Twitter handle as well, so SING Consortium, and you can follow us there.
And just to kind of expand on that, I understood that it was sort of a one-week workshop. Could you give us a couple of a little bit of insight into what is covered during those workshops? You clearly talked about some of the ethical principles, but what else is covered? Yeah,
so we actually offer the opportunity for students to sequence their mitochondrial genome. It's totally voluntary, so we don't require that, but it's lab training. So it's a couple days, and then introduction to bioinformatics, talks about data sharing, and we bring in a lot of guest speakers. A lot of times we try to have workshops geared around a certain topic. So microbiome, genetic technologies. So we really try to bring speakers in for that. And of course, we accept all applications from students, but also like graduate students, postdocs, even community members. We've had community members come and want to just learn more about what's going on within medicine and academic communities, and just learn from other tribal communities, because I've learned a lot from people who came in from New Zealand and people who come in from Alaska. So it's just kind of a really great way to just mingle and just learn from other people's histories. And
very good. I know one of the concerns and the issues that have come up for us from Mountain States is just trying to kind of get involved in the communities and or getting kind of that contact. Is that still kind of the important way to go about thinking about research? Like, is there some, how do you get your kind of, if you want to say, foot in the door in some of these communities, given the history that we hear about?
I think it's really important that researchers really try to engage with the community at the community level. I know that researchers are super busy and they just want to kind of stay in their little realm and their little offices and write grants and be in their labs. But I think it's really important that you show your face at social gatherings. Obviously, with COVID guidelines, it's made it a little bit harder. But I think attending, important cultural events, I think, is super important, but also looking for those key people, those organizations that are within the community, to reach out to them and see what their priorities are, because I think it's important not to impose their own priorities into the community when they're already kind of taxed. They have they're just trying to make sure that their community is healthy and that they are providing services for like housing and income and things like that. So just really kind of getting the feel for what's going, like the pulse of the community. And if you feel like there's some really good champions who are willing to work with you and collaborate, then really work with them and talk with them and, okay, what are the priorities for that community, and develop those questions and goals.
Very good. Okay. The next question, it says, you were on, quote, the Experiment, unquote, podcast produced by The Atlantic, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that?
So I was just approached by The Atlantic to do a podcast, and I think they thought what I had to say was interesting, but it's really just kind of from my point of view, how I was raised and my cultural upbringing and my traditional perspective on genetics and the Navajo Nation's moratorium, and how I got to where I am today and where I see genetics research going for Native people. And I think for me, culture is at the center, and that my people are very resilient, and that we have the ability to determine whether we want to engage in genetics research or not. And I think because the moratorium is under consideration currently, I feel all these researchers looking at me and the Navajo Nation. And as soon as that policy, if it's ever amended, the moratorium, there's going to be so many genetics research coming onto Navajo Nation asking us for our biospecimens and DNA, and I think we need to take that in the perspective of our traditional perspective, because I think our prayers and our culture have really guided us and brought us to this point in time, and saved us from the long walk. And I think that's something to be valued and something to not dismiss. And I know we're truly trying to walk in this Western world with our traditional practices, but I think there's a medium in where they collide. So take a listen to that podcast.
Sounds good. All right. What are your thoughts about large genome initiatives like All of Us that we heard about yesterday? How do the programs fit into working with the Indigenous people?
I think it's kind of more of the same thing. I don't think the All of Us program really engaged with tribal communities, knowing that there was this whole mistrust in the past. I mean, they're still trying to just do this, like impose their frameworks and their programs on us as Native people when we don't fit. It's kind of like a square hole and then putting a round peg into it. Like, it's not going to fit. Like, we have to start from the ground up, I think, and really start with, okay, do we have Indigenous geneticists within these communities, and how can we bring them together to fund them and see if they're willing to be a part of this All of Us program and help build it from the ground up, because they're going to be the ones that are in the know. And so I think in the All of Us program is talking about how they're accepting samples from Indigenous peoples, but they're not going to release the tribal affiliation when they, give out the data. And then there's also talk of just kind of holding that information of Indigenous peoples who have participated so far and just holding it there for now until, I don't know who's going to say, go ahead, release that information. So All of Us doesn't know what they're doing. I think they would like to know what they're doing, but I think they ultimately don't. And I think there's been a lot of pushback from me and other Indigenous geneticists to really say, hey, like, we want to be partners in this and not subjects, and just be housed in a biobank so you can just mine our data. So.
Do you think there's several times you mentioned the need to give results back and those sorts of things? Do you think there's more of a desire for that from the Indigenous people population versus from kind of the other populations? I think I know of certain research protocols where we basically very much straightforward say you won't get results back, and people are okay with that. But do you think there's a different because of your cultural beliefs that they want more of that information back?
I think everybody should ask for their information back, because I mean, for me, I feel like it's sort of a DNA on loan. It's like DNA is a gift and DNA is sacred. And if you're going to be mining and doing all kinds of things with it, like, I should hope that you'd be able to say, okay, well, we're giving this information back to you because it's yours. It's coming from you and you want the information back. And it's about your people who are connected to you. And it's a sacred thing that researchers should be recognizing. So I think it's important that everybody should be calling out researchers to get results back. Why wouldn't you? Because it's their information.
Yeah. Good. All right. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. So we have a few minutes left. Is there anything that you would have liked to share had you had more time, that you want to, any specific points you want to continue to make?
Yeah, I think there was a discussion that I was a part of recently where I think we just need to do a lot of work with the system, and because the research system is not really working, I think is what I'm trying to say, is that just going in, doing helicopter research and coming into communities and taking samples, doing research and then publishing and making a name for yourself. And then these journal magazines and so on are allowing people to publish about Indigenous specimens and other people's. I think we just really need to fix that. I think it's very linear process and it's very hierarchical. And I think we need to really recognize that community members have a huge impact on the community. And I've always been taught that traditional healers have a PhD, right? They have a PhD. They know what is going on within the community, and they understand these nuances of DNA and genetics. And I think journals need to recognize that we're sovereign nations, that we're self-determined, and that they shouldn't just be accepting any papers that supposedly have community engagement. I think they should expect more from the researchers. So I feel like there's just kind of this like cycle. And I think also I would like to say that we're not anti-science. So I hope people stop saying that we're anti-science. I think we're just very careful, and we think a lot about these issues and about our DNA and about our data and our information. And I think the researchers should be coming to us to really figure out, okay, what is the happy medium, and that we need to build a better system going forward.
Absolutely. Yep. Well said. So, well, I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and for your insight. We appreciate your participation today.
Thank you.